Today on Alimentos y Emociones podcast, we're going to talk to Dr. Kimberly Mallan, who is a senior lecturer in psychology and assistant deputy head of the School of Behavioural and Health Sciences at Australian Catholic University. She started her research career in the field of psychophysiology, where she studied basic emotional and learning processes. A keen interest in child development led her to investigate these processes in children, specifically in terms of how they learn taste preferences and develop characteristic eating behaviors. Working with students and other researchers in Australia, the US, and the UK, she continues to examine the ways in which parents play a role in their children's eating and food preferences in order to better understand the dynamic feeding relationship within families. This research is aimed to provide practical and non-judgemental support to parents faced with the sometimes challenging task of supporting healthy eating habits in their children. We welcome Dr. Mallan to talk about child feeding practices. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Alimentos y Emociones podcast. I'm really pleased to introduce today Kimberly Mallan. Hello, Kimberly, how are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you, Claudia. Great to be here.
We've managed to sort of get, our schedules together and be speaking from Mexico and Australia. So I'm very excited about that, getting the timeline right and, being able to coincide. Thank you so much for being here. And I think that I really wanted to make this episode about, sort of healthy eating in children in general and trying to, coincide on this topic, or maybe not coincide, but discuss particularly all the work that you have also done, regarding this area and obviously related to appetite, which has been, the reason why I decided to do this series of podcasts. So I want to start where I start off with, everyone I've been able to talk to up until now. And just ask you, how did you get into this field and how did you start in this area?
Well, I sort of fell into this area, to be honest. So I did my PhD in psychology and I worked in a psychophysiology lab for a number of years. So looking at basic kind of emotional and learning processes. But I always had a real interest in kids, and I worked as a behavior therapist with children with autism disorder. And so I really wanted to bring my research kind of into that more applied space, something to do with children. And an opportunity came up to work at Queensland University of Technology with Professor Lynn Daniels on the Nourish project, which was an obesity prevention intervention. And so I was lucky enough to get that position and really haven't looked back since then.
And you did quite a lot of work there. Maybe you'd like to sort of just tell us a bit more of what you did then and what, how it linked with, the appetite, not just the children's sort of eating behavior, but how you got into these areas of appetitive traits as well.
Yeah, so I think that when I joined the team with Nourish, most of the other researchers on that team were from a dietetics perspective. And so we were collecting a lot of data on, how many cups of milk the children were drinking per day and so forth, and also taking anthropometric measurements as well. And so from my psychological perspective, I guess that's where I was more interested in the behaviors that were going on, and not just the behaviors of the parents in this feeding intervention, but also the eating behaviors of the children. And there wasn't a huge amount of work in this space, particularly in Australia, when I started with Nourish. So this was sort of back in 2011, 2012. And so really one of the first things that we decided to do was to start doing some validation of the children's eating behaviour questionnaire to look at, how it held up in an Australian population and also in some cross-cultural samples that we had access to as well.
Yeah. And then you also then sort of moved down the sort of life course and into babies, and then again with the adult eating behavior questionnaire. So you kind of managed to collect data on both children, parents, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I guess, starting off with that area of sort of, early childhood, I then started to, go backwards to things like the early infant feeding, so breastfeeding and formula feeding and bottle feeding and the other like parent feeding practices in that space, and to really look at what impact those might have on something like eating behaviors. We need a questionnaire that's valid to use in that age group. So the baby eating behavior questionnaire, when Claire Llewellyn developed that, I was sort of immediately jumping on the chance to use it and validate it in our Australian samples. And then, moving on further from that, it was when you developed the adult eating behavior questionnaire. Again, it was just from my research perspective and my own, curiosity to see how all these things link up. I really wanted to see how, again, we could use that in Australian samples, and particularly to look at the concordance between maternal eating and their children's eating behaviours as well.
And have you managed to, actually, I have to say that thank you, for your validation, of the ABQ, because it has been extremely helpful, in the validation of the ABQ as well in the Mexican population and everything, because it's that reference point of just being able to, because, validations are a bit, they're a bit sterile, I call them, because you're doing all this analysis, it's kind of not, you collect the data and that can be very interesting, but the actual process of the validation is a bit, it's not very nice.
Look, to be completely honest, I think myself and some of the other people I've worked with just get quite nerdy about validations. Yes. And kind of enjoy doing them. But, we always just saw it as this first step. Let's just establish that this questionnaire is going to work in our population and then go from there. And I think particularly with the AEBQ, it really filled a gap that we noticed in that with looking at adults' eating behaviours, the questionnaires that were most widely used tended to look at kind of maladaptive eating behaviours like emotional eating, external eating, eating restraint and so forth, but didn't necessarily tap into things like food fussiness, which is something that became, such a central focus of our work in children. And so that's still something I really want to look at in terms of maternal or paternal fussy eating and how that relates to their feeding and their children's levels of fussy eating as well.
Yeah, I find that a really interesting subject, but a really interesting area as well. But we haven't actually found, I found a relationship between fussy eating with sort of much younger or toddlers and mothers right now that we've been working on, not with sort of older children. Sort of like, there are no associations with sort of like the older children and the fussy eating and their parents. So
interesting, yeah.
But it's an exploration. I mean, we've got to sort of go down that line and start working things out, especially with the degree that fussy eating had, the heritability of fussy eating, which helps a lot as far as like parents. Stress is concerned about, am I feeding them wrong, or is this actually something that's slightly out of my control?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you hear often anecdotally from parents that, who have more than one child, that, they might have thought that it was all them that made that first child an amazingly adventurous eater, and then suddenly number two comes along and they only eat white bread and cereal. And so I think parents then take a step back and say, okay, maybe it's not all about what I'm doing, but there's something, genetic with these characteristics, which obviously we do know from twin studies anyway.
Yeah. So where has all that work taken you now? Are you still using some of the questionnaires, or are you, you're venturing into what is your research currently?
So we are definitely still using those questionnaires. I think that my work in this area is certainly not done yet. I've got lots more questions that I want to try to find answers to. A bit of work that we did do just a few years ago, just to kind of give a bit more context, was really to look at the potentially bidirectional relationship between the feeding practices that parents are using with their children and then those eating behaviours of the children. Because it's sort of, again, since I've started in this area, there's been interest, there was sort of the assumption that the feeding practices influence the child. And it's a one-way street. And then it was, no, actually the children's characteristics and eating behaviours may influence how the parents feed. And so we looked at longitudinal data where we had 3 time points to really look at, the kind of back and forth effects, and did find that with food fussiness, that is, appears to be a bidirectional relationship with maternal feeding practices. So the mothers are going to respond differently to the fussier child.
Yeah.
But there are feeding practices that mothers use that are either going to lead to the child potentially being more fussy or continuing to be fussy as they get older, versus, actually seeing a reduction in that food fussiness.
When were these, how old were the kids when the data was collected?
So fairly young. So the first time point was 2 years, and then about 3.5 years, and then up to 5 years.
Yeah, which gives you the whole sort of toddler, preschooler sort of spectrum.
Yeah, so moving,
which is a really interesting time of the life course, basically, because there's, not, the toddler kind of gets left out a bit. I think you kind of tend to go, so much emphasis on infants, and then all of a sudden they get slightly older, and it's like, okay, right, well, next stage.
Yeah, absolutely, because there's that sort of that gap between when babies are, predominantly on a milk-based diet, and then they're sort of, suddenly a preschooler. But what happens in between is it's a bit, I think, under-researched for sure.
And this is the kind of, so that was work that you did a few years ago, and finding this relationship with food fussiness must be, really, it sounds really interesting, and the relationship with the parents. What about now? Where has that taken you now?
So moving on from that, we ended up doing, one of my PhD students, Kim Jackson, did some qualitative studies into some of these feeding practices that appear to be problematic. So she was particularly looking at restriction. So this is where parents are restricting their children's access to certain foods, trying to maintain a healthy diet. And what she found from this was that it's a much more complex phenomenon than we've probably been measuring in our questionnaires. And there's a lot more to do with mothers' communication. So whether they're telling their children specifically, no, you can't have, lollies, they'll rot your teeth, they'll make you fat, whatever it might be, versus if the mothers are much more subtle and covert and are, simply not bringing certain foods into the house ever if they don't want their child to eat them. And the mothers reflected on their experiences with their children and their children's behaviour in terms of whether they're asking for these foods, whether they'll eat a lot of these foods at parties and so forth. So what I'm looking at now with my current honours students is different forms of restriction, so overt versus covert restriction, and how they relate to children's eating behaviours.
And how do you measure this overt and covert sort of restriction?
So the scale that we've used is the Feeding Practices and Structure Questionnaire. So this was one that I was involved in the development a while back, but it was really primarily Elena Jansen's PhD thesis at QUT. And so it measures kind of non-responsive practices like this overt restriction, as well as more structure-related practices, which are thought to be more supportive of children's appetite regulation. So things like, having family meal times and this idea of covert restriction, where the parent's controlling or structuring the food that's at home, but not in a way that's, explicitly labeling things as good or bad to eat. So the results of that are indicating that, as we expected, overt restriction does seem to be associated with more problematic eating behaviours in children, whereas covert restriction, we're not seeing those problematic associations. And so that's been interesting, yeah.
Yeah, that is really, and I think that kind of, there's a lot of literature around that as well. But this overt, this sort of type of, feeding practices, how would they relate to the different appetitive traits, for example?
So in terms of the literature that's out there, it tends not to distinguish between overt versus covert restriction. Right. There's not a lot there, but we have done a systematic review of meta-analyses to see, what is out there. And overwhelmingly, your typical restriction or overt restriction does seem to be associated with greater food fussiness, greater food responsiveness, and also greater emotional overeating.
So it's sort of, would you say it tends to make the children more food fussy, or would you say they were food fussy before and that makes the parent be more overt?
Well, I think that this is always the the chicken and egg So, I mean, I think with food fussiness, it might be that, if the child is fussy, then the parent might need to perhaps more, they might feel the need to really restrict these sort of junk foods or unhealthy foods because they're desperate to get the child to eat, something substantial and healthy.
But then they might only eat that because, they might only eat that sort of food and that they won't eat anything else.
Exactly. I mean, this is the thing with food fussiness, and I've looked at this before when I was looking at food preferences, is that fussy children don't like vegetables, they don't like fruit, but they're fine with junk food. No fussiness around chips and chocolate. So those are the foods that these children are probably quite happy to eat. So that might be why there's more restriction in place. But at the same time, we don't know whether the effect could also go in the other direction. And similarly for things like food responsiveness, if we've got a child that, is really motivated to eat by the sight and smell and presence of food, then again, those parents might feel the need to kind of restrict and control what their child's eating a little bit more than a parent whose child is, not particularly motivated to eat just by looking at food. So it's difficult to disentangle that, but there does seem to be some evidence, in the literature that restriction can have these negative impacts on children's eating behaviours.
It slightly takes me back as well to Ali Fildes' work on food preferences, and I know you've worked with her, and she's spent some time working in Australia with you, and I think when a part where she actually saw that, for example, you had higher enjoyment of food and higher enjoyment of food, and the preference for sort of fruit and vegetables. So you think, hang on a second, what's going on there? And I always think, well, maybe, the parents, we tend to feed them the things we know they're going to like. So even if it's just, one cucumber and that's the only vegetable they eat, then, that's what I'm going to give them because at least they're eating. That's that as a mother, at least they're eating something. So when you ask them, do you eat vegetables? Oh yes, they do. They eat a cucumber. So it's a difficult area to measure, but I don't know what what you found there as well. I do, but what have you found there as well around food preferences and these types of sort of restrictive eating? Have you measured that?
Well, something that we're looking into now, which doesn't necessarily specifically look at that, but I think it's in the ballpark, is looking at mothers' orthorexic tendencies and how that may influence their use of these restrictive feeding practices with their children. Because I think that there's so much, in the media nowadays about healthy eating, clean eating, plant-based diets, raw foods, and unprocessed foods and so forth. Paleo,
anything.
The list
Keto,
goes on.
Paleo, anything, yeah.
And I think that on the one hand, while I'm obviously passionate about healthy eating and that sort of thing being in this area, I think that a lot of these things are really just trends that are the diet industry just wrapped up in different packaging again. So I think that there's a real danger there. And, that's why we were interested in looking at this idea of orthorexia in the mothers and how that influences their feeding. And what we've actually found is that seems to be more influential than eating disorder symptomology of the mums in predicting whether they're going to use high levels of restriction with their children.
Wow.
So, what the impacts that will then have for the children's not only eating behaviours but also their food preferences is something that I haven't looked at yet, but certainly of interest because, there are a number of, issues associated with orthorexia that we know of in terms of nutritional deficiencies and the impacts on social and emotional and work functioning when people really adhere to this idea of clean eating. So that's something I think needs to be pursued because it's a relatively newish kind of concept that I think, 10, 20 years ago when we were potentially first looking at this area, it wasn't really an issue, perhaps.
Yeah. And it does sound, actually, I always find that, again, as a dietitian, when you have mothers that are so heavily into fad diets and they start, restricting their children's eating because, no, you can't have this or that if it's not organic, and no, sorry, you can't have any milk because, I don't know, whatever that, or that, or it's not plant-based, or they start, turning their kids into vegans, or I don't know, all sorts of practices. And again, like, as you say, in this either verging on orthorexia or with very high sort of orthorexia tendencies, that can be, I think, really quite problematic,
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I haven't really looked at as closely as I'd like to, but was something that was coming out from my PhD student study where she was looking at these qualitative interviews with mums, was the role that, modelling of behaviour and just our language around food, how that projects onto our children and how that's going to potentially influence not only their attitudes to food, but their preferences and their eating behaviours as well. So I think that's an area that we really need to try to investigate a little bit more closely and, really see what impacts that has in addition to these sort of, these feeding practices of restricting or pressuring children to eat or using foods as rewards that we have, got a pretty good idea of what happens when we use those too much.
So, I mean, essentially, if you've got a mother who is all the time obsessing about food or all the time worrying about, the quality, the type of food that she's eating, and then also, going on diets, and like you say, maybe more so orthorexic than, anorexic or other types of eating disorders, or you're finding is predictive of future child's health or weight, or both?
I mean, it's hard to know. I think that, I guess my interest in the eating behaviors in general was always because there are so many factors that influence weight status.
Yeah.
That, the argument that it's a direct line from, one variable to weight is, that's obviously not something we can really do. But I think that, the eating behaviors, I think that there's enough evidence to suggest that for both our physical health and probably our mental health as well, certain eating behaviors are probably not going to serve us well. And so if we're seeing higher levels of those maladaptive behaviors in children, even if the children's weight is, within normal range, I still feel that that's potentially cause for concern, because, as those children get older, we know that eating behaviors tend to track. So we might not see those impacts on their physical health till they're perhaps adults or teenagers at least. And I mean, as I said, a lot of my research has been done in quite young children. So we don't necessarily know what those impacts on weight are yet. Yeah.
And now you've been doing like all this work, as well with relating to sort of mom and dads and in mealtime, and maybe for mealtimes, and maybe not necessarily like distinguishing or distinguishing between fathers and mothers and the effect that would have. How has that where has that taken you to? Because that's another interesting subject at the moment. Is it just us who have influence over our children, or is it also the fathers?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I've been able to work on a few different studies that have in some way or other involved fathers. And I think one of the big challenges is that there's not much data out there on fathers and child feeding. And I can sort of hand on heart say that that's because it's very, very difficult to recruit fathers to studies. But I think what's important is, from a starting point, I don't think it's fair to put all the responsibility of child feeding onto mothers.
Yeah.
And it's also not fair to assume that they're the only ones who would have an influence. So fathers, to varying extents, are going to be involved in mealtimes with their child, or feeding their child, or making either selection of food for their child, or modeling eating certain foods. So fathers definitely have a role. And some of our early work on fathers feeding indicated that they may potentially be more controlling in their feeding of their children relative to mothers. But there was no suggestion that the impact of fathers' feeding practices on children would be kind of null and void just because the mother might be the primary caregiver.
Right.
So one of my PhD students, Holly Harris, she did this mums and dads study where she recruited pairs of parents, which was great because a lot of the studies before that were like just dads or just mums.
Yeah.
But with recruiting the pairs, she was able to look at concordance between the feeding practices of the mothers and fathers. So we could have mums and dads who are both, say, using high levels of non-responsive or quite controlling feeding practices. We could have pairs who are both using low levels. And then obviously we've got the combinations that are discordant, where mum's doing one thing, dad's doing another thing. And this study was only cross-sectional. So again, we can't be looking at,
directionality.
Whether it's directionality, whether it's the child or the parent that's sort of leading the way. But what we did find was that, the ideal scenario is when we have both parents feeding in a responsive manner. So that concordance is really critical in terms of children's food fussiness and having lower levels of that. So what that means is that even if mum is doing all the right things, so to speak, if the father is out of sync with that and being more controlling, then that appears to have an impact or at least be related to higher levels of the child being food fussy.
Yeah, I think that's again, I think we all need to work more on that, on those areas as well of, trying to, I'm going to talk to Holly as well. So, might ask her a bit more about that.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. She can expand well beyond that.
And so how would you say that all this work that you're doing is sort of taking you to this like non-judgemental support of parents and how they face, the task of supporting their children in their eating behaviors? How do you see this playing out, with you've got on the one hand, you want to give children healthy eating, you want to create healthy eating habits. And then on the other hand, you've got, children who, already have sort of weight issues or other sort of issues. And how do you deal with those? How does that, how does your research sort of help you unpick all this area, which is a bit red hot at the moment, I'd call it?
Oh, I think it's probably always red hot. Anything to do with parents and their children.
Yeah, you're right.
I think that there's been quite a big focus on what parents are doing wrong and what the harmful feeding practices are, and not nearly enough on what they can do instead. And I think that while we can tell parents, look, it's best not to, use overt restriction with your child. It's best not to pressure them to eat. It's best not to use food as a reward. We need to give them replacement strategies because, feeding children is not an easy task. And I think from my, early experience when I was a, little teenager working with these children who had, a range of developmental disorders and feeding was a big issue for those kids. I saw that parenting is not easy and feeding children is not easy.
Yeah.
And managing children's behavior can also be a struggle. And that's when we might use food as a way of rewarding good behavior and a way of modifying, children's behavior in general. So I think that I'm really trying to push towards, okay, well, these might be problematic strategies to use with kids, but what can we do instead? And I think the restriction one, that's why I think I'm so interested in pursuing that further, because, we know that being super permissive and laissez-faire with feeding children is not going to necessarily work either. We can't be, have all the candies in the shop, I don't mind.
Yeah.
So we need to find that happy balance for parents to try to strive for. So I think that's where the covert restriction is a worthwhile avenue of, a pursuit for my research. And I think then, not going to the extreme with the healthy eating. That's why, again, I'm interested in looking at mother's own eating behaviors, but also things like the orthorexic tendencies, so that it might be possible to, in interventions, provide parents with insights into their own eating behaviors and how they might be influencing how they then feed their child. So they're sort of maybe using some of that baggage that they have about their own eating issues when they come to feeding. So I think for, establishing healthy eating habits, the Nourish trial that I was involved with, I think that kept it really simple for parents. They sort of used Ellen Satter's work and parent provide, child decide. So the parent is responsible for providing healthy foods for the children, and then you let the child and their appetite cues guide how much they eat. So, really handing over responsibility at that point to the child. And I think that's a really good sort of general message for parents. And then in the space of children who are already overweight and obese. I think that, again, that's not really my area of expertise. I tend to work more within that normal population. But I think that's where, again, you know, some of these ideas about thinking about the parent's own eating issues, if there are some, which there might well be, and how they're influencing that feeding relationship is another angle that we can look at, so that we're not putting it all on the child.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds about right. So when I did my PhD, I finished off, you know, after the development of the ABQ, with an appetitive trait tailored intervention. And that paper's coming out very soon now, finally. And the way we looked at it is that basically, you know, and the tendencies now are all about tailoring, or all about, you know, individual sort of help. So what you do is you take the ABQ, and then you kind of, you know, you give people scores for their eating behaviors, and you sort of say, right, you know, you're very food responsive, and you're very, you know, you've got very low satiety responsiveness. So here are some behavioral recommendations that could go with or without, you know, nutrition information in this particular case, in order for you to, you know, try and, I would even say, maintain your weight. You could aim for, you know, weight management in general.
Yeah.
Okay. So imagine, I'm just thinking of, like, you know, what you're mentioning right now. So you could have like tailored behavioral recommendations for sort of a more covert restriction of eating, you know, and sort of say, right, these are, so I guess they're all in the nourish, but just pick them in that particular way and say, right, for your, you know, if you want to try and have a more covert type of feeding, then try these recommendations. And if you wanted to try and, you know, and look at your own eating behavior, because you've got these sort of orthorectic tendencies, then maybe you could try also these types of, you know, behavioral recommendations. What do you think about that? Am I going too far?
No, I couldn't agree more. That's where my head's been at for the past few years, really. And that idea of a tailored intervention for parents, you know, was what sparked my studies, where I was looking at, you know, the relationship between the maternal and the child eating, going, you know, okay, well, these mothers are higher in emotional overeating or food responsiveness, and, you know, what feeding practices are they using? So, you know, and to try to use that as a tool to say, okay, like, you know, maybe you're using these practices, maybe they're not the best, you know, and these are some other strategies. I think the other thing is that, you know, Nourish was targeted as a very early intervention. So the intervention modules were delivered before the child turned 2.
Right.
So really early. So I think that, you know, we need to provide support for parents as children, you know, move through that toddler phase where they are going to be more fussy, regardless of whether they're super fussy or not, or they're just being defiant, who knows.
And more emotional overeaters.
Yeah.
Well.
And I think the emotional overeating thing, that's something that is probably going to emerge as they get a little bit older.
Yeah, a bit older. Yeah, just slightly going more towards 3 or something. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think.
And up.
Yeah, exactly. So I think working with parents with slightly older children to sort of give them, you know, even if they have participated in some early intervention, but to give them more of a top up. But I think also just to help them navigate, you know, it's tricky. We've got, you know, school lunches, what other kids are eating, parties, the grandparents and their treats, and just, you know, navigating that, and for parents not to feel that they need to, you know, be kind of, I don't know, Instagram perfect with what they're feeding their child, but also not just tossing up their hands in despair and giving their child a lollipop just to keep them quiet.
Yeah.
And I don't say this in a nasty way, because, you know, I've struggled with the fact that I think, oh, how can I research in this area when I don't even like cooking? You know, the meals that I serve my children do not look attractive. And, you know,
and if anyone asks me to make little boats with cut out, you know, I always say to my students, if anyone asks, you know, tells me that the way you're going to get a toddler to eat is because you're going to, you know, make little giraffes on their plate, well, you know, I don't have the time to do that, and I don't want to cut out little giraffes, so find another way, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, it's really important to be realistic for what it's like for parents, and particularly mothers who really at the end of the day still are often the main caregiver, that, you know, working mums have enough on their plate, and we've got extremely high expectations of parenting these days, that I just don't feel like putting pressure on parents about food and feeding their kids is going to help anyone at all. So I think, you know, really simple, easy strategies, not worrying about the aesthetics of the food and not being paranoid about the health value either, are probably the way that I'm thinking interventions could really help parents.
Yeah, in a way, kind of, again, more covert, relaxing more and still keeping some form of boundaries.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, if that's possible. I don't know if there's anything else that you would like to say, Kimberly. This has been really interesting. I mean, I say this in every interview I've had so far. I could stay here and talk for the next, you know, however long, and pick your brain about different ideas and everything. But I don't know whether you want to just sort of close off with something. This has just been really, really interesting.
Oh, thank you. No, I've just, I've really enjoyed having a good chat about this area, which, you know, I've obviously been so passionate about. But I think, yeah, just really what I said at the end there is that I don't want parents to feel that, you know, we're kind of asking for perfection with all of this. And it's really just about kind of, you know, the small little strategies that can make hopefully a big difference in kind of kids' relationship that they build with food and what they eat. And, you know, I think that that's enough.
Yeah. Yeah. If only. Mother's expectations, hey?
Yeah.
It's a really difficult one. I mean, there's a lot out there to unpick, as you've said. Is there any like social media that you'd like to direct anybody to, or how would people contact you if they were sort of interested in, after listening to the podcast, just maybe I can leave your email or something like that? Or
yes, I sort of fly under the radar with social media, but my email is fine.
Okay, that's fine. No, I just ask this because, you know, sometimes people are more interested in posting information, others not, and that is fine as well. But I was, you know, again, I always say to my students, it's just really important to keep in touch with, you know, the people doing the research. And thank you so much for everything that you have contributed. I promise you that at least, you know, in our lab, you are very well known and everyone is always citing your papers. And so thank you for all the work that you've done, again, with the validation and where all of this has taken you to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia.
And anyway, I just want to say to everybody, please remember to, you know, to like the video and to share it with those who would, you know, be interested in learning more about, you know, these children's feeding practices. I will also leave links to some of Kimberly's papers that, you know, you might be interested in reading about. And I'm going to say what I always say after the end of every podcast, which is just remember, we all, you know, we continue to nourish each other through these talks. And thank you very, very much for, you know, taking the time to listen to these conversations with us and with me. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye, Kimberly.
See you later. Bye.
Nos vemos en un próximo episodio de Alimentos y Emociones Podcast. Y recuerda, nos seguimos nutriendo.